Wow. Well, welcome to On Democracy with FP Wellman. I am Fred Wellman. Welcome, coming to you from the beating heart of our nation in St. Louis County, Missouri. We are finally finished the midterms with an important win by a guy I really think highly of, Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock, on Tuesday, clinching the 50-win seat majority for our friends the Democrats in the Senate. You know, we're entering that post-election analysis and hand-wringing portion of the series right now as people look at what they did, what they didn't do. Our friends in the Republican Party are doing some of that. Not really. They're not going to really do anything changing. The Democrats certainly are, you know, but there's no denying that President Biden will go down in history now as one of the most successful midterm first-term presidents. I think the first guy to gain senators in a century, only 3 people in a century have done that, FDR and JFK, and now Joseph R. Biden actually gained Senate seats. So there's no way to avoid the fact that he's been very successful. It's funny seeing Newt Gingrich even recognizing that the other day, which tells you maybe some people are paying attention, but not paying attention enough. So having said that, as we leave the midterms behind, the show, I really want to start spending a lot more time in the show talking about our democracy, the elements of our democracy, and what matters to it more than just electoral politics. And so one of the guests I've been trying to get on the show for a while, because he's become a friend in the last couple of years, is here. So we're going to not waste any damn time. We're going to get right to it. So on with the show. Again, welcome. I am Fred Wellman. Welcome to On Democracy with FP Wellman, the show we talk to smart people fighting for our democracy every day. As I mentioned before the break, I am thrilled to have our guest. I've been fighting to get her on the show for a while. She's a busy woman, Soledad O'Brien, of course. Welcome to the show. She's an award-winning documentarian, journalist, speaker, author, philanthropist, CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions now, which used to be, I can't remember the name before. You had an older name. Currently anchors and produces the Hearst Television political magazine, Matter of Fact, with Soledad O'Brien. Latest project, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. I just watched it this week, currently being broadcast on MSNBC and available on Peacock. She's also carved out a really interesting niche, very directly calling out for our media to get their shit together and to fight disinformation and inform the American people accurately. Soledad, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you fitting us in.
Of course. You make it sound like, I don't know, that was a long list of stuff I'm doing. I just feel busy, crazed, but thank you. It's nice to finally have our schedules match up. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your flexibility. I know it's thrilling. And you know, we met the first time, you probably don't remember it actually, when you debuted the documentary, The War Comes Home, at the National Press Club in 2016. It was the first time I got a chance to grab you. I was running my old company, Scoutcom, working on veterans issues. I was thrilled to see what you produced, and it was a very touching documentary about, the challenges a lot of us face. And it's funny for me, if you know my journey, I think you know my journey now, is at that time I was kind of dealing with my own, the realization that I actually was one of those people on the film who was dealing with the aftermath of war, but had kind of avoided it for most of his adult life. Came crushing home not long after your documentary. I think it was one of the pieces that kind of made me start thinking that maybe I wasn't as clean out of this thing as I thought it was. And so I really appreciate your work in that way. And then last year, 2 years ago, you kind of called out the Lincoln Project on Twitter. And I said, hey, I'm right here. Let's talk about it. And God bless you. We had a great conversation on Twitter. And then you invited me on your show to have a refreshing conversation about what we were doing.
Our first chat, I remember I was in the Hannaford pushing my grocery cart with the phone like this, chatting with you, telling you everything I hated about the project.
What I hate about your organization, like, okay, that's fair, but that's great. And that's what we learn, right? I mean, I appreciate that. And here we are. I finally got you to come over here. I think I warned you. One of the first things I always ask the guests on the show is I loved learning the lesson, how'd you get here? You started off in the traditional broadcast journalism. You're the daughter of immigrants. You're a daughter of parents whose marriage was illegal in many places when they were married. You've got a remarkable personal journey. But how'd you end up where you are now with your productions and your value and the impact you have on our democracy? I mean, Jesus, it's just a year ago, February of last year, I think, that you actually testified before Congress about disinformation.
But, I think it's going to sound so cheesy, but I think I'm 56, and I remember very clearly getting into my 50s and just being, I don't care. I don't care about feedback. I don't care. I know people care about how many Twitter followers they have and are they curating their feed the way. And I remember going into all this stuff like, I'm actually just going to do it the way I would do it. And I have no idea if it's the right way, if it's the wrong way. I don't care. I'm just going to do what I like. And I remember that being a very freeing thing. When I left CNN to start my own production company, I just remember thinking like, I think I can do this and I think I can make money at it. And I think it'll be better than being in a place that is clearly just having some struggles, even, pretty early on I recognize that it, like, I just didn't want to be there. And my husband would say over the years after I left, listen, if you hadn't already quit, you'd be quitting now. So
there it is. Yeah.
So, there was this whole idea of just like, I think the metaphysical, like, how did you get there, is sort of feeling like if people aren't happy with what I'm saying, I fully understand, and that's okay. But I don't really care. If you don't want to invite me to your event, I'm totally okay with that. If you like Van Jones and I'm clearly don't, and that upsets you, I don't care. And in the nicest of ways. And I just, so I try to curate all that stuff just around like what I like and what I'm thinking. And that means one thing might be, for social media at least, dogs. And then the next thing might be, something about journalism. And the next thing might be a really interesting thread that I've read. And, so, and I'm sure there's a million consultants who would say, oh my God, this is just a train wreck. You can't have all these things mixed in together. But I'm like, I like it. It works for me. I don't know if it works, but it works for me. So I think the kind of the broad answer is I just really got to the point of I was going to do what I wanted to do. I was going to do the projects I wanted. I was going to work with the people. One of the nice things, being an entrepreneur is so hard that one of the really few nice things is to be able to pick who you work with. Right? Like, there's so few perks. You can run your schedule to a large degree whenever you want, but you're working so many more hours that it's kind of a mythology, right? It's not like, yes, I can absolutely arrange my schedule to go do something and take a kid to a lacrosse tournament or something. But for the most part, you just end up staying much later working or getting up much earlier to finish it or whatever. Yep. And I just remember thinking like, wow, the one perk that's a really great perk is you just can surround yourself with the kind of people you want to be around. That's a really great perk. And I was going to take advantage of that. So I think that's kind of not the non-specific answer, but really the answer of how I am here today I'm sitting in my, and I live in Harlem. I'm sitting in my little bedroom, my little podcast, good lighting up.
Yeah.
Because I just sort of decided that I was going to try to make decisions to do what I wanted to do. And they're not always the right decisions. Sometimes they were stupid and I made a lot of mistakes, but I felt like when it was a mistake that was my mistake, I felt better about it. Like, oh, I'll learn, versus a mistake that I was stuck doing because I agreed to work with somebody whose values I didn't share.
Well, it's such a great journey. And it's funny because we're similar in age. I'm 57. And I went through some of the same catharsis, right? I had retired from the Army. I had my company that was working in the veteran circles, and then Trump came on the scene, and I had very strong feelings about that, obviously. And I agonized because in my world, in that world I was in previously, in the veteran service organization world, there's people, unfortunately, there's an access, right? If you go after the president, you don't get invited to the signing ceremony. If you go after the president, you don't get invited to the meeting at the VA. So I found myself in a situation where my professional life was being impacted by my personal political opinions, right? And it was very freeing. I remember as the country was doing, actually, we're doing very well in 2020. We went into 2020 very strong, but at that point, I just had enough. I was so sick of the silliness. I was sick of Trump. And I was at a ball, some kind of award, you know how it is in DC, right? and this guy's like, Fred, man, I'd love to hire you for our nonprofit and all, but you're the best PR guy in the business for veterans. You bring in the money for everybody and all, it's great, but they just don't, they wouldn't like your politics. I'm like, well, I guess in retrospect, then fuck you. To be honest, I was like, dude, then I don't want your damn work. If you're so much of a coward that you're more worried about what the board's going to think about my politics than doing the work for your organization, I don't even want to be here. And then of course there was a pandemic, and you're right. I was like, what do I do? And then I'll add my side of it too is, and me on Twitter, I do just what I just did now. I drop F-bombs, and I've got my own brand of being sort of raw. And I remember when I got the executive director job at Lincoln, Steve Schmidt calls me up. Steve, look, you got to stop with the F-bombs on Twitter. We already got one Rick Wilson. I'm like, bro, that's my brand. I don't know what to tell you. I'm not trying to do it. I'm not trying to do it, Steve. I'm just mad all the time. And I'm going to say it like it is. I was a soldier, for God. It's funny. I talked to my girlfriend about it. She goes, God, you were in the Army for 22 years. What does he think you're going to say? I was like, well, there you go. So anyway, so I feel you. But that does bring me to the topic of your show. I adore your show. Matter of fact, it's a good show. Yeah.
It's a really good show. And I was so not interested in doing a show when I left CNN.
Yep.
I had done it a week, like 3 hours a day. It was just a lot, and I'd done it for a long time. And so, but they approached me about doing the show, and really we shoot one day a week. And I was like, okay, I think that just logistically I could make that work. But the woman who's our executive editor really is just so smart about the stories that we cover. She's just brilliant. She's been in local news forever.
Yeah.
From Wisconsin, and it was and her name is Rita Aleman, right? And people say Rita Aleman. So here I am getting on the phone with somebody who I think is like a Latina, blah, blah, blah. And she's got the most Midwestern, like, Wisconsin accent. Can I ask you how you got your name? She's like, oh, I was married to a guy. But it was, so I really love that her perspective is very middle of the country, right? She's always interested, but like, what do people in Wisconsin think? Well, how do people feel? She's not sort of obsessed with, right, which I think a lot of journalists are obsessed with as much, what's going to happen in DC? Are we getting invited to this thing now? How about the thing in LA? Do we want to be in New York? How do we do, like she's really very much, but what about the hospitals in Indiana? What's happening in Wisconsin? Right. Missouri, like she's just so interested. And I think part of the reason she is because that's where she's from, like that it's where she lives. So it's really her home. So she's just constantly every day in and day out spent talking to people there about issues. And so I love that because I'm much more New York and I live in Florida in the winter, but I'm a New Yorker. And I've been for a long time. So I have a lot of New York perspective. Right. So I think it's what's made the show really good. And then long ago, very early on, we're in our 8th season, and we decided not to put politicians on for the most part, partly because it was in the middle of the the whole sort of first years of Trump, and everybody would just lie and make stuff up, right? Like you couldn't get a really good, and some of that is just how TV news is going, right? Just the idea of giving a platform to unmitigated bullshit constantly was very problematic to me, and it's also exhausting to do interviews where you're bringing people on who are going to lie, and you're just spending the entire time fact checking them, right? As opposed to having a conversation and getting their honest point of view or even honest facts from them. Right. You just are kind of like the referee of like, well, that didn't happen. Actually, the quote wasn't that, and that didn't really go that way. And actually, here's what he said. It's exhausting. And so we started realizing that we could look at policy and center people, and not sort of center this idea of like, what are the DC politicians? We just remove the middleman who were the politicians. So if we wanted to do something about, some legislation that was going to affect Native Americans, right, we would literally just go to Cherokee Nation and talk to people there. Right. And it became really interesting. I mean, it's so funny. I was thinking just the other day, because this week's show has a story about this 200-year-old treaty, of course, that America failed to actually honor. And now the Cherokee Nation is like, well, we get a representative in Congress, and we expect to have that treaty honored after 200 years. So, and I was like, wow, we have probably done 20 stories on Native American. I mean, so many more than I ever did when I was at CNN. And this show it's half an hour once a week. I mean, it's a very small show. It's doing really well for us, but it's a small little show. So I do feel like we really, by removing politicians as middlemen, we actually end up having very interesting people talking about the things that are really real in their lives. And that's, I think, has made it really an interesting show. And it's doing very well for us. It does very well for in Missouri, by the way. I'm sure. And I described it in my notes. It's journalism on a mission is how I felt. I watched last week's episode just to make sure I was up to date. And one of my favorite portions was the woman who got famous on TikTok doing recipes from WIC ingredients. And that's such, it started off like, oh, a TikTok lady doing recipes, but it's such a great story for the layers of the issue, because we talk about the stigma around WIC. We talk about what these goes into, and here's a young woman, a lovely woman who's very good on camera, talking about, I just decided to start doing recipes with the crap I can buy, and it took off. And one of her most popular recipes was grilled cheese and homemade tomato soup, all from WIC ingredients. And I'm like, that's good journalism, because it could have been a story about TikToking, but it wasn't, was it? Two other things. One was that, everybody's doing an inflation story in some case, right? That's our. Right. Our inflation story is not going to be, I'm standing here live, look at the gas prices at this overpriced gas station. It's going to really sort of focus on solutions and what people are doing, like a regular person And then number two, if Rita were doing this interview, she would say, you should know that our producer, Ash, was a young woman who is one of our producers who pitched that story. And for her, the execution of a producer's idea brought to life that does well on the show, like, is part of her journey of really mentoring our employees and making sure people have the kinds of stories that they want to see on the air. Yeah. So it's been really fun to work on a show where you also don't have to do something that I think we do a lot. We did a lot when I worked at CNN, not as much as I think they do now, or maybe things are changing. I don't know. I haven't really watched it in a while. But I'm not even mean that as a dig. I just really haven't. But you kind of have to have like this opinion or this opinion. The idea of somebody explaining something complicated. Like, I feel like our best show that we've ever done for that, for a matter of fact, went to Puerto Rico to look at the grid and how solar power was helping some Puerto Ricans actually remove themselves from the grid so that they could be kind of in control of their own destiny. Right. 2 million people. And I just remember thinking, like, I could never have pitched that, right? I'd never been like, whoa, Fred, I've got a story for you. We're going to go do solar power in Puerto Rico. Never,
so many clicks. They're going to click the shit out of it.
But today, you kind of have to pitch. I'll tell you actually a funny story. I was on Chris Matthews' show before he left that show, and he had me on to talk about Fidel Castro had died. And right before I went on, they said, we're going to put you up against Jose Diaz-Balart. And I'm like, up against, right? Because it has to be.
It's a competition. Bad guy die.
But whatever. And I kept saying, I mean, it was a terrible debate, which it was not supposed to be a debate, because I kept saying, I agree with you. Like, he was taking the side that, Castro was a terrible dictator. I'm like, my mother fled Cuba. So yeah, I totally agree. I mean, what side am I going to take on that? But Batista was a dictator, a terrible dictator too. But I mean, if you are interested in understanding what all these people are mourning a guy who they would also simultaneously tell you ruined Cuba in a lot of ways. Like, right. Aren't you curious about, like, don't you want to learn something? And the answer was clearly not really, right? We want you and Jose Diaz-Balart to fight, because that drama is what's going to get picked up. And you see that a lot, right? Nobody says we need some smart people to talk about from their own perspective an issue. Instead, it's she needs to say this, he needs to say the opposite of this. They're going to go at it for 4.5 minutes. And what we are hoping is that that'll either get clicks or someone will pick it up and it'll then get put on another platform. And then that'll be a win. And so I think our show has been very successful. I'll brag without really, I'm not a big bragger, but I'll brag about it because I really think, like, we've been successful because we actually try to explain. So what is the First Amendment? Everybody says, it's the First Amendment, but let's dig into it. Where did it come from? What's gerrymandering exactly? Right. Who does it? How does it work? We try to dig in and explain things and have smart people who I don't need to fact check them, right? They're not bullshitting me. I don't have to hold them accountable because I know they're lying. I can just say, so you're a professor who's been studying this. Can you explain what your research found? Or whatever.
Pulse ox, and melatonin, right? Those kind of complicated stories that matter because it's affecting a large a growing part of our population, by the way. And in the middle of a pandemic, the pulse ox doesn't work, for God's sake. Those are important stories.
Right. That's so crazy. I mean, it's fascinating. And so that to me has been so much more interesting than, ooh, she won that fight, or ooh, he lost that fight, which, as we know, we frame political debates this way too, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily even have an impact on how people vote at the end of the day, right? You could have someone who everyone thinks they won that debate or they lost that debate. And at the end of the day, it may not be correlated with anything else at all. So why are we so focused on that kind of stupidity? And often people don't even agree. Yeah. So, I think it's been very exciting in an environment where the news, I think, is sucking often, especially when it comes to politics, to be able to say, well, here's an interesting story that we think is important. We're going to give someone who's smart a few minutes to explain in a thoughtful way about what their research is finding. And it's been working for us.
Which brings me to the next topic, which is, it segues right into it, which is, one of the things I say a lot, I think both on Twitter and on here on the show, is that in many ways it feels like our institutions are failing us in this moment in America, right? That there are government institutions, the DOJs, that the traditional institutions are not aware. And one of the ones that gets a lot of my ire and yours, is why you and I bond over it, is the media as an institution, that they don't seem capable of increasingly they're not they're not able to meet the challenges of this moment. They're like calling things racially charged instead of racist, right? Instead of calling something controversial instead of a effing lie. No, it's a lie. Just say it's a lie. He lied. Okay. No, he's a racist. He said a racist thing. That statement was racist. He didn't. I mean, you and I just recently I think we were both sharing the anger over the Nick Fuentes thing, where I think New York Times, how the New York Times tweet say it was like a controversial past statements. Controversial past statements. The guy's a fucking raging anti-Semite. He literally said, I mean, there's no couching this, and this is how we end up with this both sides bullshit. I mean, I'm passionate about the both sides bullshit. I had something I bring up a lot on Twitter. Is I have a son-in-law who's a National Guardsman in Virginia. He stood around guarding the effing Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally. I was laying at home with a brand new knee that I just gotten replaced, sitting there having to watch this thing unfold 100 miles from where I lived in Virginia, knowing my son-in-law was, when I saw those soldiers in the background, that was my kid, as these jackasses attacked each other over a effing statue, allegedly. So, I mean, you have strong opinions about that. I mean, what is driving this cascading failure of this institution, in your opinion?
I think a lot of it, honestly, is social media, right?
Okay.
Journalists will reach out to me and say, can you retweet this? Because they have to,
right.
Their life depends on being viral. A lot of stuff's not viral, right? A lot of explaining. So, let me explain to you why this vote is has this implication and what this could mean, right? Some stuff is just, you need to understand it. And unfortunately, I think when you make everything sort of like compete for eyeballs, it's not really a way that I think journalism should be judged, but it is now. So when, you see the New York Times get into a lot of, right? I mean, what's her face from the New York Times, who's so awful, Pamela Paul, right? She cannot get enough of like bashing trans people. It's the craziest thing. I mean, I bet Pamela Paul has met maybe one trans person in her entire life, like you would think.
Or did and doesn't even know it, by the way, because 99% of the time you have no idea, by the way.
Exactly. Right, but you would think from her writing that like day in and day out, this is a thing that she's grappling with. So once again, she's going to write about it. It's the craziest bullshit. It's just so insane. Right. But they understand that these are little buttons, right? And they hit little outrage buttons, and that's a way to get readers and way to get engagement. There's hate engagement, there's liking engagement, but there's engagement, and that's better. Like a toddler, right? Engagement, even hate engagement, is better than no engagement at all.
Right.
And so I think that that's just the way the whole structure has been set up, that you need some kind of engagement, is really kind of crazy. I'll give you a great example. So I live in Florida in the winter, and the New York Times real estate section did a little thing on my floors. I'd gone on Twitter. We've been painting my floors with a girlfriend of mine in Florida. And there were a handful of people, maybe 10% of the people were like, oh my God, how dare you paint your floors? But like, understand, until it got to that debate, like the story was uninteresting.
Right.
It didn't matter to me. I mean, I was painting my floor. I don't care. But like the whole thing had to be framed as, there's a debate over blah, 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 blah.
Right.
The truth is there was a debate, but it was about 10% of some, mostly, I'm going to guess, a handful of bots and some crazy people. And then, some people who were like, I just wouldn't paint my floors. But it's a classic. Every story has to be framed as some kind of outrage. Could have been framed as, I decided to paint my floors to save money because I really can't get to renovating that house for a couple of years because we got to do it's a front and back house. Got to work on the other. Right. There's a million other ways you could have framed it. But if you don't frame it as like someone's outraged, then forget it. You really don't have a story. And I think that's super, super problematic.
Yeah. And it's weird. I'd be lying if I hadn't say I had benefited from that, right? Let's be honest. Like me, especially my personality online, if you know my personality online, my thing is snappy replies to awful people. I think somebody said the other day, that's your brand. Like, I mean, literally about every time Lauren Boebert says something stupid, the meme of me telling her, when she said my pronoun is patriot, and I replied to her, literally, you love these things. I was getting in my elevator at my old apartment with my dog because she had to walk outside, and I saw Lauren Boebert saying her pronoun was patriot or something like that. And I said, that's a noun. So is idiot, and it went viral. And now every time somebody's, she says something stupid, somebody retweets that. It is a very, like you said, it's like there's an endorphin rush, right? There's that dopamine dump of the anger machine. that we're seeking out. I had a guest talk about that dopamine rush we get from the anger machine. And I don't know how we break the cycle, because there isn't enough of folks like yours where we're saying, hey, this is an important issue. Here's the facts, actual facts. We have separately sets of facts now. And you ended up in front of Congress for that, right? I mean, the disinformation
doesn't have much of that. Like I guess if there's anger, it's like, well, this system is broken, right? Or this,
justice.
But it's not sort of a, here's the person who's gonna be on air and we're gonna mock them or make fun of them or fight them. It literally is, well, is this unfair? I mean, what do you mean if you have darker skin, some of this technology may not work on you, and no one remembered to test it on anybody? Interestingly, not only did they not test on people with darker skin, they didn't test it on babies, right? So all the babies in the NICU are hooked up to these things that no one's actually ever tested them. So so like if there's any outrage, it's that. But yeah, it's and I don't mind snappy, like I don't mind it. It's just that for journalism to only have that, it's just very and to have it always be framed as some kind of fight. Because I mean, a friend of mine, a guy named Steve Perry, years ago, I did a doc on him, a Black in America doc, and he would call me and he would say, he's a school principal, and he'd say, they'll call me and they'll say, there's a story today about this. We're looking for a person who's going to say such and such. Not, so you've been a principal now for 35 years. I love your take on it. Or, you're a principal in a big urban school. Could you talk to this? Like, let's take your expertise and leverage it. It's, we need someone who's going to say these things. Will you say it? And if your answer is no, you won't get booked. Right. So if Steve wanted to be on TV, or if he felt it was important for him to be on TV, then he would say, yes, I'll do it. And he'd say it because, because as you know, these things are all correlated to how you can get paid and you get to come on more. I think Greenwald is a really good example of understanding, like, the more nasty and trollish you can be, the more likely you're going to be a star of Fox News. Yeah. So, I just think Steve was like, well, that's ridiculous. I don't believe that. Why would I say that? It's just, and also as a principal who's done it for a long time, it's not even accurate. Like, no one should be saying that's not the debate shouldn't be a fight. There are some really interesting, new, complicated nuances. We should talk about them, but nobody wants to really have that conversation. It's so weird because, while CNN tries to figure out what it's doing, I think if they did that, they would do better. We have just found tremendous success in it. And I actually think it's an indication the audience does want to understand things. They do want to understand. Why can't you just fire that terrible teacher? And someone needs to say, well, so let me explain how this stuff works, blah, 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 blah. And I don't think cable just doesn't seem to have an interest in making people smarter about it. They just want you to be outraged. But he's a terrible teacher. Why is he not being fired? And tomorrow, as if due process doesn't matter. So, I just think that we have found really great results in kind of thinking more highly of our audience. Like, I think the audience actually says, gosh, I do want to understand this. Right. Wow, that's really interesting. I'll give you a good example. You had your knee. Do you get your knee done or your hip done?
2 knees replaced. 2 old Army knees replaced.
My doctor just told me I'm going to need a knee replacement, but not for a little bit. And
do it. Changed my life.
Getting that hyaluronic acid injection. When you're, it's sort of always described to me as a little like you get 3 injections, one every week for 3 weeks. And it always was just, my husband's had it for a while. So he describes it as like a little cushion, it's a little cushion to help take over, the meniscus that you've lost or the cartilage that you've lost. So I was asking my doctor really how it worked. Turns out that's wrong, completely wrong. My husband had it wrong. I don't know. The doctor's like, oh, no.
Write that down. Like, there's our clip, Matt. You're in trouble now, sister.
I was telling him yesterday, I was like, I thought like that it was squishing in a cushion, like this acid would gel and get in there and make a cushion. And it's not at all. It's a painkiller. Okay. The doctor's like, no, it just dulls some of the nerves in this certain thing. You're like, oh, that's all it is. It's a painkiller that lasts, up to 2 years or something. Completely different of how I envisioned it. And I think that, like in journalism, there's so many other ways to really, you think it has to be a certain way in a story, and it doesn't. You don't have to market it that way. You don't have to sell it that way. You can actually, rethink how something works and how people learn from it. And you could be more respectful of your audience and assume that they actually want to learn something.
Yeah. And do you think ratings, I mean, I last week I had Mark McKinnon on the show, and Mark actually was one of my professors, if you will, at Harvard, and I went to grad school. I dropped the H-bomb, sorry. When I went to grad school. Thank you for your tax dollars sending me to grad school. Thank you. Anyway, I want to talk about, I know you're a Harvard person, yeah. But Mark, we used to joke in Mark's class is like celebrity of the week. So the Tuesday class would be him teaching a really good lesson about storytelling and political storytelling. And then the second Thursday was like some amazing guest from the Wonkette to, Alex Castellanos. I mean, his Rolodex is freaking nuts. And it was interesting. He brought in the founders of Politico as they were founding Politico. This is 2006. And they were just launching Politico. And I remember them saying, the traditional model, and they're real excited about this. And now I'm like horrified. But the traditional model in news was you had to win the day or win the month or win the quarterly ratings. And then you went then you have cable news and they want to win the day. Our model is going to be win the hour. And when Politico launched, that was their idea, was they're going to have stories all the time, winning the hour. Of course, they chewed through reporters because of that. And now we've got, I think now we're zeroed in. We got to win the minute. You know what I mean? It just feels like we've gone through this far arc where everything is a competition. If you're always in competition, you've always got to be fighting the other guy. You're not actually, like you said, if I got to win the minute or win the segment, I'm not doing long segments that explain really hard things, right? It seems like a circling the drain, though.
Right. I think that, I really think Politico is trash. And I think
yeah, there's that.
But that they really constantly show you that they are trying to win a minute and not sort of being thoughtful, like constantly, they often, get shit wrong, but
yes.
they're just thoughtful, where it's like, let's help people understand this thing. It's just not, maybe that's just not their model, but I think they're really not very, I think the reporting is not good, but I guess if your strategy is to win the minute, which I'm not sure why it would be to win the minute. Every so often they do have some interesting reporting. They do have some good reporters who do come up with good stuff, but so often I'm like, God, Politico is just trash. There's just so much crap out there. And they're also obviously to win the minute, then you really need to be an access journalist in a lot of ways. So they have some reporters who are just absolute pure access journalists, and they talk about it. They're not ashamed of it.
Right.
Unfortunate.
Well, that's a drag. I want to kind of, as we get towards the end of your time, I really want to talk about the documentary. Is it? I've seen you say, is it true that no documentary has really ever been done about by Mother Parks? I mean, and I watched it and I was engaged. I was like, it's just what a fascinating story. I can't believe. She was not. They and look at me, white guy, middle. I grew up about 5 miles from here literally in a subdivision built around a golf course. Okay, so that tells you a lot about my upbringing. Okay, and I had the vision of Mrs. Rosa Parks as being this sweet little lady who sat down and was, and then you watch the documentary, it's like, nah, man, this is a plan. They had a teenager get arrested, but she wasn't going to be a good witness at 15. So they were kind of hoping that maybe, and sure enough, Mrs. Parks, who happens to be the secretary of the NAACP, but it's a very different story. She wasn't a sweet little lady. She was a damn soldier, wasn't she?
Yeah, it really was. She was so hardcore. Also,
right.
You think of very old and grandmotherly and tired. Even the New York Times, when she died, eulogized her as the accidental matriarch of the movement. And you're like, there was literally nothing accidental about Rosa Parks. From the age of 8, where she's, hanging out with her grandfather who's got a shotgun because he's going to take out members of the KKK if he has to really the, moments before she died. Like, she was constantly working on the cause. There was absolutely nothing accidental about her at all. And so, we were surprised when the directors came to us, Yoruba Richin and Johanna Hamilton, and it was based off of a book written by Jean Theoharis, who's a beast on Twitter. She's really worth following. Johanna, the director, had been had read a Twitter thread, actually, of Jean Theoharis's, and every birthday of Rosa Parks, Jean would write like 25 things that you didn't know about Rosa Parks. Cool. And, Johanna, I think like most of us, was like, well, I know a little bit about Rosa Parks. and she said, she'd get through number 1, like, I kind of knew that. But by the number 25, she's like, I know none of these things.
None of these things, right.
And that's really what led to the documentary. But I think, so when they said, there's never been a doc done, of course, I was like, but we probably should really double check. I was utterly shocked. And I think it's, one, there's just not a lot of video of Rosa Parks that exists. but also you don't even really know what her voice sounds like, right? There's some people in history who we know exactly what they sound like. So we were lucky. Lisa Gay Hamilton, the actor, was kind enough to read a lot of the letters for us that Rosa Parks had written. So we had a lot of her own words in the doc. But it's fascinating the degree to which she was really strategic. And the bus boycott was strategic. And that her job before the bus boycott, her job was to go and take testimony from women who'd been raped or gang raped.
That was gutting.
Oh my gosh. And knowing both the victim and Rosa Parks, well aware that there would be no justice for this person anytime soon, right? Like, and yet she was like, well, you still need to have a record of what actually happened. And we need to have your side of this story. We need to hear from you, the victim, what happened. And I always think of like, what amazing courage. Who does that? Like, who thinks that way? It's just fascinating. So I think there were so many things that I learned about Rosa Parks. And again, I would have been like, oh, listen, you know, I know quite a bit about what I've done now. A whole bunch of documentaries.
Who I am?
I was so stunned. So yeah, it's been a great project. Anybody who wants to watch it can watch it on Peacock because it's streaming there. It was on MSNBC. I think it's a 67th anniversary of the boycott. So, or it was, so they ran it on MSNBC, and, you know, I think for a lot of people, it's a really beautifully done documentary, but I think learn a lot too. And there's so few times that I'm just stunned by something I thought I knew, and it turns out I didn't know. She was 42 during the bus boycott, you know, I'm like, I thought she was a little old lady, right? If I had to guess, I would have said, oh, she was 60. She was not.
Right.
And the crazy thing is she kept trying to correct reporters. She would say, I was no more tired than I was at any other time after work. I was tired of being treated badly, right? Which is a whole different kind of tired. But, you know, no one ever really, I mean, even when Nancy Pelosi was eulogizing her, you know, like that's what she said. Oh, she was a tired, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like so many people just got it wrong as much as she tried to make them get it right. That, you know, it's just a fascinating story. So I'm glad that
I loved it. And there wasn't 5 minutes that went by I didn't learn something new. It was powerful from the very beginning, where you do the game show where they didn't even know who she was, and was it what's his name, Mitzi Gaynor? No, the gentleman.
Nipsey Russell.
Nipsey Russell, thank you. Terrible, but what a lovely man, and the way he says, "Well, I know we're dear friends," and, you know, but you know, while she's alive, people didn't recognize her. You know, this is Mama, you know, Mother Parks, as they called her. You know, she, you know, the mother of this, and just remarkable. And I want to go back something you said funny, and actually I want to highlight it before we move on. Is you said her job was to write. That actually wasn't her job. She was a seamstress. She was a tailor's assistant. She did the volunteer, right? She was
her paid job, but she was a secretary for the NAACP. So she literally got on buses and went to gather information. I mean, that she had 2 jobs, and that was why she was always working to expand rights for Black people. She would go in and vote, and they would tell her all the reasons why she wasn't able to vote, you know, at the time. And she just was constantly like testing the system to see if she could improve the lot of Black people. So yeah, you're right. I mean, her job was a seamstress. She never worked after the bus boycott. Again, I had no idea that she could not find any job at all. Insane. Neither could her husband after the bus boycott. And that all the
patriarchy,
kind of whatever rewards came to the folks who in the civil rights movement after the successful boycott, she was kind of left out of any of that.
Yeah. It was, I really thought it was brave to take that on too. And I think it was very interesting to me to see the wonderful voices that they interviewed, you know, taking on the myths on both sides of this history, right? We have our myths on my side, the guys that look like me, but also that patriarchal part of streak that was in the civil rights movement where men sort of took the front. You know, the March to Washington had one woman speak. I love the little anecdote of Lena Horne, like saying, you know, I'm taking her. Yeah, you know, come with me. We're going to go, you know, dragging Mrs. Parks to go talk to the media. You know, it just is such a lovely anecdote of a person. And she's fighting till the bitter end, apartheid till the very end. And then, like you said, I think the coda of that at the end was that I respect Speaker Pelosi, but even Mrs. Pelosi got up there and still didn't know the true story. As we put a statue in for her life, we still didn't know the true story of Mrs. Rosa Parks. So I'm thrilled that you guys did it. I hope more people watch. I'll flog the hell out of it on Twitter and all.
Also tell people this book, which has got the same name, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, which is written by Jean Thier Harris, is a great book. I mean, it's a So I highly recommend it. If you like the doc, check out the book. It's really worth reading.
I'm going to add it to my stack of people I know.
Oh, yeah.
I know. So, well, I've taken a ton of your time and I really appreciate it. So I always ask everybody, we've talked a lot about where we can find you. So what's hot right now? I mean, other than you got the show, are you working on something else? Is something else cooking that we should know about? A new book? You got another documentary working? You got something cooking?
Gosh, no books. I can't. It's like giving birth, which is.
I'm working on mine right now. I got a memoir coming out. So God help me.
Nice. No, we're continuing to do documentary projects. We've got a bunch. It's the season to start submitting them to festivals. So we're in the middle of that. And then, you know what I'm really looking forward to? 2 weeks off at Christmas, man. I am tired. This year has been a long year. And I am so excited that in a couple of weeks, my kids will all come home for Christmas and we'll get to hang out together and just do nothing. Yep. That's what I'm looking to do. And then we start 2023, back in a sprint.
That's it. I know I'm a Politico, so I thought, well, after the election, I'll take a break, and that didn't happen. Yeah. And I talked to McKinnon and somebody else about it. I said, I'll probably get some time off. He's like, yeah, no, it's cute. You think that, but and it's not. I'm busier than I've ever been, but I'll get to see the kids here next week and the grandkids, and and I think Heather Sweet is talking about sending me off somewhere alone, so that'll be great. But and then again, finally, where can we find you online and all the different places we find you in your social media? So
Matter of Fact, if you're interested in that show, go to matteroffact.tv and we list, because it's a syndicated show. You can find it, it's in different times in different cities. Yep. I'm still on Twitter, whoever's left on Twitter, although I think a lot of people are still there.
We're still there. I've actually started gaining followers again, oddly. So we'll see how long that lasts.
O'Brien, and Instagram as well, at Soledad O'Brien. And then, probably those are the best ways to find me.
Great. I love it. Well, I appreciate you joining the show. And we'll be back in just a second. We'll take a pause and then we'll wrap things up. Thanks so much for having Soledad join us. Another great show. As always, I'm so fortunate to have these wonderful people I've had the opportunity to work with and meet, and then now have them come on the show, and so you guys can learn, the amazing things I learned about them. I hope you enjoy the show. We try to make it a personal show, so if you do like it, I'm going to do that thing we're supposed to do. I'm going to tell you, I need you to subscribe. I'd love you to like it. I'd love you to tell your friends. I'd love you to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, all of them, so we can grow the show and get more amazing guests. Next week, I'm thrilled to invite and have the Michael Steele, the former chairman of the RNC, is going to join us. He's been a friend for a couple of years now as well. That'll be a fascinating discussion about the midterms and what we face ahead. And I'm excited to talk to Michael about the choices they have to make, that these parties have to make to pick candidates. So it's going to be a great show. As always, you can find me at FP Wellman on Twitter, FP Wellman Official on Instagram. The show is On Democracy Pod on Twitter, On Democracy Podcast on YouTube, and everywhere you find it. As always, we're sponsored by my friends at Vi Media. Vi Media is a great digital marketing firm. They're based here in St. Louis. This studio is part of their wonderful network. They are your best marketing partner for anything you want to accomplish, be it in St. Louis or nationwide. I'm a big fan. They've been good to me. You can find them at vi.media, VIE.media, on the line and everywhere. As always, On Democracy Podcast comes to you every week on Thursday afternoons. Maybe we may be adding some more. We're talking to Matt about that now because things are going well and essentially I have some free time. In the meantime, please follow us on Twitter and join the conversation. Reach out to me, send me DMs. I actually get my DMs on Twitter, so don't be afraid to reach out to me and tell me good things or how much you hate me. I get those too. In the meantime, we'll see you next week. As always, have a great week and stay safe out there.